All right, let's talk quadratic formula. So last class we talked about two ways to solve quadratic equations, square roots and factoring. But if you remember when you did square roots, you could not have that middle linear term to do square roots. If you have an x and an x squared, you cannot use square roots, and some equations are just not factorable. So we needed a whole nother way to go about solving quadratic situations if we couldn't factor them and couldn't use square roots. Enter the quadratic formula. So if you remember, if I have a quadratic equation where I have some number x squared plus some number x plus some number equals 0, then I can use the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula says x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Remember, there were lots of videos that we watched on YouTube. Feel free to search YouTube quadratic formula song and see if you can find some of those if you need help remembering them. So once you're in this standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, you can then use quadratic formula to help you find the two solutions, one with the plus, one with the minus, for that particular quadratic equation. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. Real quick before we do that, remember you have to have it equal to 0 to solve or to use the quadratic formula. So if you have anything on one side of the equation, you need to move it all to the same side. All right, here we go. First example. So if you take a look at our first example, we have 4x squared minus 10x minus 10, not factorable at all. So we're going to go through and write down our a, b, and c values so we don't forget. A is 4, b is negative 10, c is also negative 10. And then I'm going to write out my quadratic formula. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now you can type this whole thing into your calculator, and I'm going to show you that in just 1 second. Or if it asks you to give you an exact answer or a radical answer, you are going to have to simplify this a little bit. And so I'll talk you through that in a second. So real quick, if you have to do the calculator, we're going to come on over here to the side and I'll show you. Remember, when you type it in your calculator, you're going to use that fraction bar first, so the alpha y equals bar first, to type those big old fraction bars in there, and then go ahead and type all of your numbers in there. I highly suggest that you type parentheses around all of your a, b, and c values, even if they're positive, just to help you get in the habit of doing that, and then you'll always get the right answer. So if it doesn't ask for exact and it doesn't ask for radical values, then I can just type this whole thing in my calculator, and I find that my answer is 3.26 and negative 0.76. Okay. So let's go back over here and take a look real quick at it simplified. So if I was simplifying it, I could go through and simplify negative 10 squared and 4 times 4 times negative 10. Then I get 100 minus negative 60. That's 260. I did my pairs, my prime factorization, remember? So that ended up giving me 2 radical 65 underneath the radical. And then I have 10, 2, and 8. All of those are reducible, by 2. So I'm going to reduce 10, 2, and 8 to 5, 1, and 4. And you can see over here, I went ahead and just typed it in just to double check my answers. 5 plus the square root of 65 divided by 4 is 3.265, which is what I got when I typed the whole quadratic formula into that equation. So I know I simplified that right in radical form. Okay. Now, another reason you might need to put it in radical form is if it is an imaginary solution. So you can see here in example 2, number 1, notice it did not start equal to 0. So before I do anything, I'm going to add 3 to both sides. Then I got 5x squared plus 4x plus 11. So at this point, I can go ahead and do my quadratic formula, write my values down, put them in my calculator. If you tried to type this in your calculator, you would get an error message. So you know that that's going to be an imaginary solution. So you have to do some simplifying before you can actually write the answer there. You cannot type this in your calculator because it will give you an error message. Okay, so I'm going to go through and start to simplify this. I get 4 squared is 16, 4 times 5 times 11 is 220. And then when I subtract those, I get negative 204. Remember, that tells me that my solution is imaginary too, because you cannot take the square root of a negative number and get a real answer. It's always imaginary. So once I'm here, I'm going to have to simplify with imaginary numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and take that square root of negative 1 out, and then I simplified positive 204 to be 2 radical 51. Remember, that's find all the numbers that multiply to 204, and then go through and find any pairs and move them to the outside. Okay, that square root of negative 1 turns into an I, so now I have 2 times I radical 51. And again, because I have a 4 and a 2 and a 10, and those are all gone ahead and divided by 2, I can simplify that into negative 2 plus 1I square root of 51 over 5. Okay, so you might have to simplify by hand with some of those imaginary numbers. Okay, let me go ahead and zoom back out. My OneNote's being a little weird, but we're going to go with it. All right, last thing I want to talk about is the discriminant. So if you remember when we did quadratic formula, sometimes they would ask you about the discriminant, and that was just to help you decide how many solutions there were. So first of all, how do you find the discriminant? Well, you just do the amount underneath your radical, which is b squared minus 4ac. So you would only type b squared minus 4ac in your calculator. Do not type the square root sign and try to figure out what that value is, okay? That value will come out to be one of 3 different kinds of numbers. It could be a positive number, it could be a 0, or it could be a negative number. Then, depending on if it's positive, 0, or negative, you know how many solutions there's going to be. So if it's a positive number, then you're going to have 2 solutions, and that's because your graph will cross that x-axis 2 times. If your discriminant is a 0 when you type in b squared minus 4ac, then that means there's 1 solution, and that graph only crosses the x-axis 1 time at that vertex point. And if your value is a negative number, then there are no solutions, and that means your graph never crosses the x-axis. Okay, so again, discriminant value is to find the number amount when you type in just b squared minus 4ac, no square root, and then that number amount will tell you how many solutions based on what kind of number it is. So positive number is 2, 0 is 1, and negative number is no solution. Okay. There is some practice down here if you want some quadratic formula practice. It looks like there's quite a bit of practice and some discriminant practice in there too. So go ahead and do that practice if you need it before you get to the Math Excel and quadratic formula next week.